politics of music in Iran. My name is Emily Godrich. I'm the chair of the Center for Middle Eastern Studies, and I'm delighted to be here to introduce you to our speaker, Nahid Siamdoust. Dr. Siamdoust received her doctorate from the University of Oxford, where she graduated in Modern Middle Eastern Studies from St. Anthony's College. She's currently a postdoctoral associate at the Yale program in Iranian Studies at the Council on Middle Eastern Studies in the Macmillan Center for International and Area Studies. Sorry, we have lots of guests here too. She's also the inaugural Ehsan Yarshatar Fellow in Iranian Studies and a lecturer in the Department of Near Eastern Languages and Civilization. Before I hand over the microphone to Nahid, I want to give special thanks to Professor Persis Karim, who's the director of the Center for Iranian Diaspora Studies at San Francisco State University, our sister institution across the bridge, for bringing Dr. Siamdoust's work to our attention and co-sponsoring this event. Please join me in giving a warm welcome to Nahid Siamdoust.
Thank you so much, first and foremost, to Berkeley Center for Middle Eastern Studies and Professor Emily Godrich, and as well as Professor Persis Karim, the inaugural chair of San Francisco State University Center for Iranian Diaspora Studies. It's the first center that specifically works on diaspora studies, as many of you, I think, know. She has been such a great sort of support and, you know, throughout the years, even though I was neither her student or really anyone she knew from anywhere, but she sort of every now and then would, you know, contact me and give me some advice, and I've just been really inspired for her, and you are a role model both on a personal and academic level, so thank you, Persis. So I'm going to plunge right in. The reason I chose to work on music was partly rooted in my own childhood growing up in Iran in the 1980s. It was impossible not to sense really the importance, but also the contentions over music. So I was not even 10 when we left Iran in the middle of the war in 1987. But throughout, so we lived there for nearly a decade into the revolution, and I have vivid memories as a child of how much music really permeated our lives. The birthday parties, the car rides, I mean, it was everywhere. And Iranian music from before the revolution, so pop music from before the revolution, musicians who subsequently, I will talk about this a great deal in the talk, subsequently moved to Los Angeles and set up their pop music empire there, really contributed to this influx of joyous, happy music into a very sort of dire, sad Iran. Really, that first post-revolutionary decade was very hard for most Iranians. They were affected by the war, shortages, deaths in families, emigration to other countries. It was hard no matter who you were. You were affected, either really badly or, somewhat badly. But it was really due to these diaspora singers that joyous space was created and were so prominent in my childhood memories. But of course, there was also terror associated with music. Turning down the volume in the car ahead of, in fear of the comités, the voluntary groups who would check cars, checkpoints on roads to, on the holidays, or even just, being accompanied, actually being taken along with grown-ups as sort of camouflage for the purchase of these tapes on the black market. When I returned again in 1996, after finishing high school in Germany, still a teenager, I couldn't believe when I saw a grand piano at the swimming pool, at the restaurant that my parents took me to. It was such a sea change from what I had experienced growing up as a child in Iran. And already within the span of about 10 years, some space had been created for music in the public sphere. And there was this piano player playing classical music at the pool. The only thing was that the thing that was, that people couldn't actually clap after the pieces. So that was still sort of, that would have put that consumption of music in public beyond the red lines, because the public expression of joy was still not okay. So this love of music, joy, dance, and fun, which I is sort of deeply ingrained in my own memories as a child and in the Iran of the 80s, was of course at odds with the new revolutionary state's disciplinary harshness. On the one hand, the official authorities have tried and still try to control the space for music, and on the other hand, people consume and practice it with fervor. It was Hossein Alizadeh, one of the most famous classical musicians, who said that because of the restrictions on music in post-revolutionary Iran, everybody's taken up the practice of music. There's now an instrument in every household and people practice it much more than they did before the revolution. So this tension throws open a very basic question. Why is music so important? And it's really with this question in mind that I trace a political history of music throughout Iran's tumultuous post-revolutionary decades. My book does two things. On the one hand, it tells the story of the musicians who, despite and oftentimes really against the given strictures, created this mass channel for communication that transformed the culture within the limits of an authoritarian state, and through which people could discuss all kinds of issues through the music, whether it was more sort of performative and effective, such as inhabiting those spaces of joy, or whether it was actually expressing dissent, like Shajarian's Vidad, really speaking out against authority. So in many ways, it provided that channel without which it really wouldn't have existed in any of the other spheres that we look at to the same extent that it existed in music, not least because, of course, music is consumed to a much wider extent than any other form of culture production, because of the ease of use and the pervasiveness and so on. On the other hand, my book tells the story of the evolution of state policy, from a severe regimentation of a sort of republic of mourning to one that has come to some degree to adapt to the needs of the people and allow for a sort of controlled fun. But at its core, my book interrogates state power. How does it work? Considering that Iran is a country with an old culture, how did this new revolutionary state justify its policies and govern what are now 80 million people? A little bit about my methodology. My work, my research was heavily interview-based, so I've interviewed all the people who I write about, from policymakers to musicians to audiences to and a lot of participant observation, going to practice sessions and concerts and all of that, and of course whatever there is in primary literature, secondary literature, and of course Persian music sites and YouTube and all of that. I promised Dr. Persis Karim to speak a little bit to the diasporic aspects of my work, so I think what I'll do today is first describe the process through which, after a 20-year ban, pop music was permitted again in post-revolutionary Iran, and then highlight some of the ways in which Iranian diaspora and the media networks and the circuitry that they have created and provided have been instrumental in making some of the music coming out of Iran really possible. So one of the most dramatic developments in post-revolutionary Iran was the revival of pop music, nearly 2 decades into the revolution. In the first months following the revolution, Ayatollah Khomeini had made a very stark statement about music. He had said, this was in a speech he gave to Radio Darya at the Caspian in 1979, and this is a statement that people regarded as a fatwa. He said, if you want your country to be a righteous country, a free country, an independent country, transform radio and television into educational tools. Eliminate music. Music is treachery to the country. It is the betrayal of our youth. Eliminate music completely. So it couldn't really be, the statement couldn't have been any clearer. And once state radio was taken over by the revolutionaries, the very first track they beamed from the airwaves of this new republic, Islamic Republic, was a song that perfectly sort of encapsulates the ideals of the revolutionaries. It was Reza Rugari's Iran, Iran, which really melds Islam and Iran in equal measure. It refers to the cries of Allahu Akbar that happened preceding the revolution on the rooftops. It speaks about, it's basically Iran, 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 Allahu Akbar, Allahu Akbar, Allahu Akbar. I'm just going to play a short segment of it for those of you who haven't heard this before. get the sense. And what I also wanted you to hear out there is the kind of music. So march music, vocals that are choir-like. So at the time, it was rhythmical music was still very sensitive, and there was nothing really rhythmical on state radio for quite a while. But then things really took a turn when one of Ayatollah Khomeini's dearest protégés, Ayatollah Mortaza Motahhari, was assassinated. And in commemoration of his passing, sort of a year into his death, some people at state radio created a piece of music to commemorate Ayatollah Motahhari. And in order to test the waters, they took the piece to Imam Khomeini. And Imam Khomeini listened to it. This is Mohammad Golriz, who's the brother of Gol Paigani, the famous sort of, singer of a whole different kind of music scene. His brother happened to be a very religious revolutionary. This is the story that he retold afterwards. They took the piece to Khomeini and he listened to it, and he actually requested to see the makers. And in person, he told them, "I don't cry much, but I cried when I heard your song. This is the most beautiful piece of music I've ever heard, and if you continue making music like this, I will support you." And so with that, really, that was understood to be also a fatwa. And from then onward, rhythmical music was allowed on state radio and television. That was really the statement that made it. The first state-commissioned revolutionary song that was musically based in the Persian Marif and really has passages that are reminiscent of the more sort of classical pop music of Haideh, for those of you who know Iranian music, was this song, which is called Shahid Motahhar, and I'm going to play a short segment of it. So it's moved beyond the march and choir and so on. I'm not sure what you were expecting, but this was problematic. So this is not some sort of dance song, but even this was problematic. In fact, I went to a FATCH music festival roundtable in 2011, and a sociology professor, Azat Rawadrod, she told the story of how she and her companions were on a road trip. They stopped somewhere for lunch, and this song came on state television. And one of her companions, and she said, we're really Daesh, they're hardcore Hezbollahis, seriously committed to the Islamic ideals of the revolution. And she said one of her companions jumped to turn off television because she just felt that sense of social responsibility. She didn't think that even though it was on state television, that it could have been something that was permitted by the authorities. It must have been a mistake. And then subsequently, of course, they learned of Khomeini's statement, and so it was accepted. But how do we explain this? How do we reconcile this with Khomeini's statement only a year earlier that all of music had to be eliminated? In fact, Khomeini's approval of this kind of music was in accordance with his earlier pre-revolution jurisprudential writings on music, which are really rooted in Al-Ghazali's writings. So the core of it being that the effect of music on someone depends on their heart. So it's a reflection of the heart. If you have a bad heart, if you have bad intentions, music encourages that. If you have a good heart and good intentions, then, and hence, because that is the understanding of music, really, in terms of deciding what kind of music is okay and what kind of music is not okay, Khomeini had two responses. One was that it really depended on the listener. The listener could decide him or herself. And the other response he gave in a istita that somebody wrote to him, a very sort of succinct response from Khomeini was orfias. It depends on convention. But of course, neither of those responses are very clear or satisfying, because in the absence of complete sort of freedom without sort of an Islamic superstructure to decide what we can or cannot listen to, a listener cannot decide him or herself whether what kind of music to listen to. And conventions, with conventions, he didn't mean conventions outside of the Islamic framework. There were conventions within the framework of the Islamic Republic, which is something that we now also understand from a conversation that was relayed by Khomeini's son Ahmad about a conversation between Rafsanjani and Khomeini, in which Rafsanjani said, well, didn't you say we should eliminate music completely? What happened? And Khomeini said, well, you know, let us assume that the music in question was broadcast by the radio of Saudi Arabia. Then I would forbid it, because Khomeini was very much against the Wahhabis in Saudi Arabia. He thought that real idol worship took place in Saudi Arabia. So the biggest evil, you would think, you would sort of point to the West, wasn't the West, it was the system of Saudi Arabia. If it happened in Saudi Arabia, then it would have a problem, and we would have to forbid it. But here, where an Islamic government in its state is in power, a different form of regulation is valid. So this kind of decision-making, where the government's interests overrule other considerations, became an established form of policy-making in the Islamic Republic. It's called maslahat, right? Expediency. What it basically means is that the interests of the state overrule even anything in the Sharia. That's something that he said verbatim. Maslahat of the state is more important than any rulings in the Sharia. And the interest of the state is, of course, its survival, what allows it to go on and govern. But Khomeini's response also left a lot of latitude for policymakers to wield over music. Which kind of music is actually in the service of the state, and which is not. And this latitude is precisely what creates so much ambiguity and leads to great frustrations among musicians. And so, you know, taklif musiri roshan nist is the sort of phrase one keeps hearing in my research. I heard it probably a million times from everyone, including policymakers, but certainly from musicians. But it is in the interest of the state not to have very clear policies on music, because then they can sort of, you know, make decisions case by case depending on the circumstances of time and the power relationships that are going on between the different factions or whatever is affecting that moment in time. Although this ambiguity also creates a lot of space for musicians. So musicians also use this ambiguity to push the boundaries and create things that they're not exactly sure will be okay, but then all of a sudden are, because there's so many factors involved in the decision-making about what will or will not be permitted. So Shad Mehra Ajili in 97 all of a sudden was able to get a permit for an album that had a lot of 6/8 rhythms, the rhythm that people thought was totally sort of beyond their line. I'm not going to talk about it today, but just brief mention, the two enduring red lines in the Islamic Republic have been the solo female voice and showing instruments, musical instruments on state television. Those have not budged. Everything else has budged. And even the instruments on state television, there have been instances. It's just there hasn't been a wholesale sort of policy to say we will allow instruments on state television. Every now and then there have been some instances. As one official commented to me, this is really because there are still powerful ayatollahs who have much harsher views on music than Khomeini once did or Khamenei does now, and no one wants to make them angry. It's not worth it. There's no real payoff. Clerics like Alam al-Huda, as you know, recently, for example, made a sort of condemning statement about the dancing girls at the city council celebration for Nowruz in March, and subsequently Tehran's mayor even resigned. He was reinstated or came back himself, but that's the kind of power that a powerful Ayatollah can wield. So how did pop music make it through in a context where no one wants to take too many risks on music? What is to account for the rebirth of pop music a little less than two decades into the revolution from within conservative state media itself? And what is to account for its shallowness today? I will try to respond to address those questions a little bit. So I already mentioned Iran's huge pop music industry basically supplanted itself into Los Angeles, hence the honorific title of Tehrangeles, and continued making music from there. But then in the late 1990s, pop music made a comeback in Iran. There's still a lot of speculations about the reasons behind the government's decision to permit pop music, but the prominent and basically accepted narrative is that the Islamic Republic, powerless to control the flow of pop music from Los Angeles, in a very calculated move, launched young singers, often with voices and styles similar to popular Los Angeles stars, in order to draw Iranians' attentions away from what it considered to be depraved content coming from expatriates in the diaspora and inward toward a more state-controlled conforming discourse. And of course, throughout, these suspicions were fueled by the similarities of voices. Oh, why do these singers all sound like Daryush or Ebi or Siamdoust? But in doing research, I found out that really the opposite was true. The re-emergence of pop music happened because of a confluence of factors, including mostly the personal agency of a few young musicians and even fewer officials who were finally persuaded by these young musicians. State media eventually co-opted this music and allowed for it to happen from within its own walls, but it didn't plan or launch it, which is what sort of the common understanding of this rebirth is. In fact, rather than being a creation of the regime, the singer who can be credited with starting the flow of pop music, and of course there were several people as part of this first generation of pop musicians, but the one singer who was really sort of ahead of them and really trying hard, Khashayar Etemadi, was inspired by a pre-revolutionary, then Los Angeles-y singer Dariush, a very popular one. And state media, in fact, rejected his attempts for many years because of the similarity of his voice to Dariush. And Khashayar Etemadi showed me these slips that he had from Siamdoust, in which there was this green ink all over saying his voice was too similar. So too similar, they wouldn't say Dariush, but too similar to the voice of these singers in LA. The fact that Etemadi, Iran's first post-revolutionary pop star, was inspired by Dariush rather than the other idols was also very important. Dariush was, at his time, regarded as a good musician. He was a political musician. He was a revolutionary singer because of his songs, and he had been critical of the Shah and had even gone to prison for his work. Like other people in the pop music, he had left Iran, but he retains a sort of revolutionary capital. So even among many of the officials I talked to, Dariush held a special place. He wasn't like everybody else. I will come back to Dariush every now and then, so I just want to give you a sense for his voice for those of you who don't know his voice, and I have a feeling a great majority of you do, just looking at you all. But I will just give you a sense for Dariush's voice. This is one of his very political songs. You get a sense for his, he had a lot of really melancholy sort of songs, and Khashayar Etemadi does it a little bit differently, but the similarity is certainly there. As far as state media were concerned, there was no one group that schemed the launch of pop. Rather, there was one official by the name of Ali Muallim Damghani, who had both an artistic background as a poet and high revolutionary capital as a friend of the supreme leader Ayatollah Khomeini, which meant that he could bypass many of the roadblocks that others simply didn't have the capital to do. They just couldn't dare to do that. But Damghani, Ali Muallim could take decisions that others just wouldn't dare to take. So after many years of rejection, with the explicit notation that his voice was too similar to Dariush, Etemadi finally gave it one last push. He sold an apartment. It was very expensive to put together this first album because a lot of the people who had worked in the pop music industry had stopped working for nearly 2 decades. They were out of practice. It took a lot of practice sessions to bring all these people back together. Etemadi told me how even just getting somebody to put together a cover for this sort of new pop music was not very easy because everything had changed. Out came the first pop album, as we understand it, in post-revolutionary Iran, called Anxiety, quite appropriately. It took Irshad 2 years to approve it, but finally the first tracks were aired in 1997. When you compare Etemadi to Dariush, it's not just the voice that's similar, it's also Etemadi's mode of singing. He's actively trailing Dariush's style. But Etemadi also creates continuity with the march-like songs prevalent on state television by relying on religious themes. There are march-like elements to his songs as well. And in contrast to the subversive political nature of Dariush's songs, his songs are all well aligned politically with the songs on state television and those supported by the Islamic Republic. I will, I think, play you a song called Manato Derakto Barun, You and Me Tree and Rain, which is really the song that most people mean when they talk about the first post-revolutionary pop music, pop song. It's not on this first album because this song was played very frequently on state radio. Etemadi's own anecdote of him hearing his own song on the state radio was that he was in a taxi and his song came on, and the taxi driver just put his foot on the brakes and said, "Oh my God, things are about to change in a big way because Dariush is back." And it was not completely inconceivable because Khatami had just been elected. There was so much hopefulness for things really changing, reforms, democracy, lots of newspapers. It wasn't completely inconceivable. And Khashoggi Etemadi told me, he was sitting on the back seat and said, "That's actually me, it's my song." And the driver just looked at him and said, "Dariush, you're comparing yourself to Dariush." Musically, the song is in fact reminiscent of the more sentimental, romantic pre-revolutionary songs, and the words are an ode to nurturing love, and sort of appropriate for state television because state television for many, many years has this practice of putting video that is of nature as a backdrop to music, because they can't show instruments, they don't want to show sort of moving bodies, so nature sort of works perfectly. I'll just play you a short segment of it, and you will hear there are female vocals, there's a sax. I don't think I'm going to get into the saxophone part because I don't have enough time to play you a large segment of it, but there's a saxophone that comes in, so it really had a different kind of sound and feel to it. So, while the state's decision to allow the production of this sanitized pop for the growing youth bulge was intentional, though not initiated, the reasons for what some perceived as imitation had more to do with the fact that these older singers like Dariush were really the only role models that these young people had. When Etemadi, the young homegrown pop musician, met Dariush, he told him, "I became a singer because of my love for your voice." And he will admit any day that he owes his inspiration in life to Dariush. On the official side, I already mentioned John Pani. He had a really intriguing response to my question about imitation. I asked him, "Well, did you guys plan this? Because that's what most people think." And it makes a lot of sense. And this was his response. He said, "Similarities in voice are accidental. This here is the mother country. Rivers flow into the ocean, not the other way around. There's no problem if the singers here are imitating their own past. This has nothing to do with Dariush or Khashoggi. They had a past that they liked, and they're imitating that past." The 1979 revolution is a stark marker in Iranian history for, I would argue, all Iranians, certainly historians, certainly politicians, everyone. Everybody views everything in the prism of before and after the revolution. And yet, Muallim here really, in effect, breaks down that pre- and post-revolutionary dichotomy and reclaims a past that has been entirely rejected by the same ideological system that he serves. In doing so, he claims agency for and authenticity for the artists whom he promoted from within state television, at the cost of appearing to legitimize a segment of that past which had been completely rejected, right, by the revolution. And in fact, I would almost argue, and it's hard to sort of put that on paper, but I would almost argue that if it hadn't been for the similarity between Dariush and Khashoggi Etemadi's voice, that perhaps this wouldn't have happened, because Muallim was instrumental in this process of re-permitting pop music. And in his mind, Dariush and Khashoggi just completely melded. He kept confusing the two in my interview with him. He kept saying this song, Bui Gandom by Khashoggi Etemadi. He was like, no, Bui Gandom was Dariush. It was like, oh yeah, Dariush. I mean, and then he kept referring to Khashoggi as Dariush. I mean, he had just like melded the two in his mind. This was just a continuation of something good that had existed before the revolution that deserved to be allowed and really promoted from within state television. So after these first pop albums were published, the first phase of real pop music still traded in ambiguities, ambiguous themes as far as relationships and love and so on were concerned. When Benjamin sang his Khateraha, memories, where he talks about closing his eyes and imagining a loved one, the lyrics were vague enough that he could pass on the assumption that he was imagining the Messiah, Mahdi, the Intizar for the Mahdi. Lyrics had to have that kind of flexibility. But now, of course, that is no longer the case. Pop singers can sing about whatever they want as long as it's not political. And more often than not, they do sing about love and betrayal. In fact, Benjamin himself now sings songs in which he talks about Ashiq Shunam, but if she finds out that I've fallen in love with her, she may no longer be interested in me. Meaning that this woman clearly is not interested in real romantic love, she's interested in physical love or that kind of relationship. So this is all sort of out in the open and it's okay. For those of you who've never been to a pop concert in Iran, I will just play you a very short scene of a concert, of a very recent concert of one of the most popular singers. Now this is the second generation of pop musicians. We've passed the generation of Khashar Etemadi and Alireza Assar and others who I write about in the book. Hamid Homayun, for example, is one of the more popular ones now. And I've chosen this segment of the video in particular because you get a sense for the audience and the cross-generational aspect of the audience and how well attended these concerts are. You get a sense for it. So, in fact, it is now really difficult to distinguish between Tehran-made pop music and music made in Los Angeles. There's also a lot of collaboration going on. I forgot to mention that the first pop music album was in fact produced by the legendary pop music producer Babak Bayat. He came back during the Rafsanjani era, the Reconstruction era, when sort of expatriates of the diaspora were in some way sort of being invited back, and Babak Bayat came back and he produced this album. And he stayed on and continued to create a lot of connections between musicians on both sides. Songwriters in Tehran still write and start writing songs for musicians and Iranian musicians in Tehran, and producers in LA would produce music for Iranians. And all this collaboration and that aspect of the connection was, of course, magnified many-fold by the internet and satellite television technology and so on. And I will talk about it in a little bit in a second. But in some ways, the process of permitting pop music remains unique. Other singers, underground singers who weren't sort of within that pop music realm, but were creating other kinds of sort of fusion music, rap music, hip-hop, all of the musicians who were part of that underground scene had a very hard time getting permits. Hichkas and Yas, two rappers who I interviewed for my book, they really tried for a long time to get permits from Irshad and never succeeded, and eventually both of them left the country. Yas goes back and forth, but Hichkas now believes that he would get into trouble if he went back. He left after the 2009 uprising, about 2 years after that, after he created a song called Yibzuhu Miyadan, which is very sort of subliminally political. I have some prime examples here that I want to show you of musicians who didn't make it out from the underground. So, for example, Battlebacks, a group who intentionally made sure that whatever lyrics they had were always, what's the word, sort of acceptable or within sort of Temai Khanwadegi, so music that people could listen to with their families. Music that didn't cross any lines of the Islamic Republic and so on. Even they never really managed to get any permits. But Susan Khanum, when it came out in, at the time when it came out in 2009, I believe, was so popular that you would hear it at every single party that you would go to. And this is a group that didn't have a permit, but was much more popular than many of the other musicians who did have permits. And I imagine many of you know this fact. So this is about a man going possibly to ask for the hand of this woman in marriage. And as you can see, the hand of the woman is clad in a black glove, so really staying within the parameters of the acceptable regulations of the topic, not showing the skin of the head. So obviously that's kind of a tongue-in-cheek criticism of Iranian society and what it takes to get a woman, right? Just pile on the jewelry and the phones and so on. Another musician, Sasi Mankan, he was sort of, he wasn't really trying to stay within the lines, but he was just kind of creating his own work, and I want to give you a sense for his work. Super popular at the time. Another song that you would hear everywhere. You can hear he's sort of fusing a lot of different elements here together. And the reason I brought up Sasi Mankan and Battlebacks is to point to this kind of music that I call hyperground. It's not underground, it's not above ground, hasn't received the permits. Either it's tried Battlebacks, really tried very hard for a long time, Sasi Mankan didn't try. But you can't really call it underground. It's so pervasive. Everybody's listening to it. It's cross-generational, right? The term underground simply doesn't capture. It's not above ground because it doesn't have the permits. I call it hyperground. I hope somebody can come up with a better term for it. But it's just, it is outside of that frame of whatever ground. And the only way it could be that, which you see on this video, is because these musicians would produce their music and their videos, and through the media networks of the diaspora, PMC, Vang, and so on, get their music out there and boomerang their music back into Iran through these channels that have been created by the diaspora, whether it's channels in Los Angeles or Dubai or London, Manitoba, and so on. But if it wasn't for that circuitry, these musicians really wouldn't have been able to be as famous as they were at the time in Iran and still are. And also, of course, the other kind of geographical circuitry that has existed because of expatriates and diaspora, which has allowed these musicians to throw really well-attended concerts in Dubai, in Georgia, in Armenia, in Turkey, in Europe, and draw their fans from among the diaspora. And so without them, this really wouldn't have been possible. Battlebacks, Sasi Mankan has left Iran. He now just goes by the name Sasi, and he's super successful, has very polished videos. He's probably one of the most popular Iranian singers now in the diaspora, so he really made the sort of the leap from Iran to the diaspora. Battlebacks is a chain of a burger joint chain sort of across Tehran, and they really want to make it work from within the system. So they're still trying and not yet successful. However, there is a chance that they might become successful, because more recently, certain government bodies and people with political connections and capital and so on have tried to bring rap and other forms of underground music into the fold, so to speak. The first sensational attempt at this was the rapper Ami Tatari's track Nuclear Energy, released in 2015 at the same time that the negotiations for Iran's nuclear program were going on. And it really marked a turning point for the rapper who was best known for love and party songs, and had tons of pictures with highly made up girls and skimpy clothing online. So that was Amir Tatari. This video was sponsored by official bodies as is evident by the fact that it shows Tatalou singing with sailors and officers from the Iranian Navy on top of an Iranian frigate in the Caspian. He refers to the Khalij Fars, to the Persian Gulf, but it was actually filmed in the Caspian. I'll just play you a short so that's quite stunning, right? He's standing there, the members of the Iranian Navy are actually singing his song. It's quite amazing. And the New York Times reporter Thomas Erdbrink actually managed to speak to the state-sponsored production company that is behind this clip, the Soroush company. And he said, you know, what is all this about? How did this happen? And he said, what better way to attract the youth to our ideals than a rapper who subscribes to those? If we hadn't changed, we would have lost our audience. And this is sort of a trend that's become very visible more recently, that the state, which initially really demonized this whole underground music scene, and in fact in 2007, when it was first becoming quite evident that this is a very vibrant scene, state television broadcast a documentary called Shock. And in it, they really portrayed members of the underground music scene as Satanists who, you know, gathered in parties to exchange blood and eat each other's feces. I mean, it was really quite shocking. And they highlighted some of the really sort of prominent figures of the underground music scene. This attempt to create a moral panic around underground music didn't really work. And I think especially since 2009, the Green Uprising, which really was a shock to the system, there's been a lot of thinking about how do we bring some of these musicians to our side, and how do we really dismantle this underground music scene, which they were completely sort of helpless about. They just didn't know what to do with it. They kept locking people up, interrogating people, but it kept sort of growing because the internet is there and satellite television is there, and you can't really stop that kind of growth of music, considering that there are all these channels that enable the dissemination of that kind of cultural production. And in fact, Tatalou was last seen, as I'm sure many of you know, supporting Ibrahim Raisi, the candidate who was running against Rouhani in the 2017 elections. This is just another sort of stunning picture, because Ibrahim Raisi is the guardian of Iran's holiest shrine, the shrine of Imam Reza in Mashhad. And so for the guardian to be sitting next to a tattooed rapper who has a very nefarious sort of past, you know, as not a very serious, you know, not a wholesome person. And I'm very sure that the decision to show his tattoos were also quite intentional, right? He could have covered up his arms, but he's sitting there and the tattoos are showing. And, you know, in this segment, he talks to Ibrahim. There's a short video of this. He talks to Ibrahim Raisi about, Raisi says, oh, didn't you make a song for Imam Reza? And Tatalou says, yeah, we, you know, oh, yeah, we really, what I really like to say is that Imam Reza is for everyone. And really trying in a quite sort of interesting way to perhaps convince some of the youth who supports Tatalou, he had at the time 4 million followers on Instagram, that there was a possibility to, you know, support a political persuasion that would have been really against a lot of what these young musicians are for. Other people and organizations have also been at work getting permits for formerly banned rock musicians, in the process curbing both the content of the music as well as their onstage persona. So bringing some of these people from the underground music scene and allowing them to have concerts, Zanyar, King Ram, and so on, but really giving them some, you know, some boundaries as to what they can, what can be part of their discourse and what cannot be part of their discourse. Rock musicians who are told not to move too rhythmically on stage, and so on. And in a conversation that I had, in a public conversation that I had with Mohsen Namju about this whole process, he declared that he believes that the underground music scene in Iran is dead. In fact, he said that all of the arts were dead because of what is going on. And I'm still trying to figure out if that's some, how to describe what's been going on. But aside from this clear government cooptation of free music, state bodies have also been actively supporting works of culture production that attempt to claim some of the most powerful images and icons of the Green Uprising, for example. A real demonstration of brute force, I would argue, that relies on the great funds and means available to pro-state actors, means that are obviously not available to those who don't represent such a total ideological commitment to the Islamic Republic, is sort of evident in the work of someone like Hamid Zamani. I'm going to show you a short excerpt of his work, We Will Resist, which is really an attempt to take back Azadi Square. Azadi Square was the prime site of the Green Uprisings, 2 to 3 million people at the largest post-election unrest demonstration around Azadi Square. And of course, there are a lot of sort of iconic images of people climbing Azadi Tower with a sea of Green Uprising supporters around Azadi Square. And this video is a sort of attempt to sort of reclaim that and co-opt the coolness of that scene. And I hope I have the scene where somebody forms of culture production or these kinds of works actually have an impact in persuading perhaps youth that does not ordinarily sort of subscribe to this ideology is hard to gauge for me. On any day, Sasi Mankan and Battlebacks and so on have many more clicks on their videos than somebody like Hamid Zamani. So Hamid Zamani. But perhaps it at least is doing some work in retaining the support that the revolution still has among the youth. The field of music, I hope, in this sort of short presentation that I gave you, I hope you could see that it's a real reflection of the intensely contested questions and values that are ultimately at the heart of projections about the national project of a present and future Iran. And I just want to conclude, perhaps conclude by just presenting some remarks on a question that I posed at the beginning, which is, why is music so important? At its very base, it's important because it's able to reflect and mediate political sentiments that are difficult to control. The meaning of music is created between the producers and what Michel de Certeau calls secondary producers, so the consumers. It's not just what the producer creates, but it really happens between the producer and the consumer, and in there, and the projections and meanings that are projected onto that work is where the meaning of the work really happens. And there can be decades-long narratives that are reinvigorated or redefined and continue to carry meaning. So in my book, I write about Shah Jahan's Morgha Sahar, for example, and how it really points to this century-long arc of a freedom repertoire, right? So when people partake in the song Morgha Sahar, they're not just in that moment calling for the caged bird to break free. They are referring to their century-long struggle to bring freedom to Iran, and instantly it carries so much more weight. And there are, of course, meanings that this last track that we just watched, for example, attempts to negate or co-opt because they understand the importance of those meanings. The government tries as best as it can to take politics out of music, and especially to disable the concert's political capacity. Because the concert, I argue, is still one of those rare places where people, complete strangers, can come together and coalesce over a discourse that they agree upon and that they can present, a sort of representational site for performing the public. It's one of those rare instances in which this can happen publicly in Iran. But many of the most significant musicians whose work I write about can no longer perform in Iran, like Shajarian, for example. He did get a permit for an album after the Green Uprising, but never again received a permit to give a public concert. And of course, he's been very ill lately, and it appears that unfortunately they took away his capacity to create that kind of powerful setting of his concert since 2009. Or, for example, I read about Namju and Hijkas. They've left Iran, they can't perform. I also write about the band Oham, which is commonly sort of called Iran's first post-revolutionary, really popular rock band. They were very, very popular, sort of end of 90s. In 2001, they gave what is now sort of called the first underground rock concert in Iran after the revolution in the Orthodox Church, because in the spaces of minorities and in foreign embassies, those are outside of the jurisdiction of the Islamic Republic, so some concerts had taken place in these spaces. And so Oham had this concert in 2001. They failed to get a permit for their work, tried for many years, and finally, of course, they used the internet to disseminate their work. They were super popular, gave concerts all over the world. And then finally in 2014, they did receive a permit as part of this sort of new effort to allow some of these musicians to perform above ground. Finally, they did receive a permit to give concerts. In fact, in the music halls underneath Azadi Tower, their performance spaces. And I happened to be in Iran then and went to their concert. And it was really heartbreaking because they've been in the business for so long that the majority of fans had brought their children to this concert. It was an amazing concert, and it was so meaningful and so sentimental for those present. But it had happened, but it had been a long time. But it now seems like we've come around to a phase where the government has indeed at least attempted, and I think possibly succeeded in dismantling the underground by really enabling a lot of the most prominent musicians and the more popular ones to perform above ground, but with circumscriptions, and the political potential of the live concert. So really not allowing people whose live concerts create that kind of performativity of politics to take place. And it seems like really we've come to a phase where expatriate musicians are presenting some of the freer music out there. As we can see, for example, in a group like Objiz, the Swedish-Iranian sister rock act, who just last week came out with a track that directly comments on the ban of women into sports stadiums. And I just want to show you a short, this came out literally like a few days ago. I'm sorry to cut that off. So where we are right now is, whereas authorities initially policed music on Islamic sensibilities, so themes and, it couldn't be sort of about real earthly love or, movement on stage and so on. They have eased restrictions on that and now strictly monitor on political content, even trying to co-opt someone like Tatalu, the tattooed rapper, as we saw. So Imam Khomeini's policy of maslahat, or expediency, has culminated in this. Considering Iran's huge youth population, this state allows for this entertainment space to exist. But whereas Khomeini's edict was meant to support committed music in the service of the revolution, it now translates into permitting music that is not explicitly against the revolution. And more recently, as we saw, there's been a parallel track to co-opt or create committed music that speaks to a younger audience that no longer responds. So Hamid Zamani's does respond to sort of Islamic ideology, but Tatalus is really sort of nationalistic themes. They've really now put their finger on that. They realize that is a theme that has a lot of hold on Iranian youth. That is something that they can attract the youth with. So creating committed music that speaks to that audience that no longer responds to Islamic ideology. And I think I might just end it there. Thank you. On SoundCloud, 10 songs that define modern Iran. And if you think someone might be interested to just learn a little bit about Iran in a different way, not through sort of straight up politics, but through cultural production and music and so on, I hope you can tell them about it. I would love to take some questions.
Sorry, what was the name of the podcast?
So if you go on Google and just type in SoundCloud, 10 songs that define modern Iran, or 10 songs that define modern Iran even without SoundCloud, it'll come up. You don't have to have a SoundCloud account. You can just listen to it, even if you don't have a SoundCloud account.
And then I had a question.
Sure.
I was just wondering about the role of the women in Iran. You didn't touch on very much of how, at what point, kind of lost track of when they allowed women actually on stage, or do they still? If you could just quickly touch on that, that'd be great.
Sure. So, as I mentioned, one of the enduring red lines has been the ban against the solo female voice. And however, sort of women have been very active in the field, but they've just been really banned from performing solo. But they started sort of entering the stage in a very visible way with the band Aryan in the late 90s and 2000s. They had female vocalists and even a female guitar player. And so their re-entry onto the stage happened sometime around the time when pop music was permitted again. And they've been quite active and present on the stage as instrumentalists, as back vocalists, but obviously not as solo vocalists. And so they've continued to give some of them completely reject the idea of giving concerts to all female audiences, which they're allowed to even sing solo. So someone like Parisa refuses to do so. Other famous singers, Siamdoust, they refuse to do so. They just say, that is putting the category of female musicians, and Farzaneh Milani is somebody who argues this in a lower category, simply by virtue of closing them off to half of Iran's population. Other musicians, but Parisa gives concerts abroad, as do other musicians, but on stage, it's been very difficult for them. However, there's been a lot of activity around female musicians, especially recently. In 2014, Mahdi Mohammadkhani was this young vocalist, up and coming, very popular. She sang a passage of a song solo in the very official Talar Wahdat. And this made news headlines the next day. The first time after the revolution that a woman sang solo. And in fact, the Minister of Culture was apparently present. He had to deny his presence because it became such a hot button issue. And the man behind that is Majid Rakhshani, who was part of the Chavosh group and collaborated a lot with Chajarian subsequently and so on. He's really been behind putting together the Khorshid ensemble, a lot of women, Ma ensemble, Khorshid ensemble, a lot of women ensembles. And in another talk, I talked specifically about the role of female musicians in Iran and how even Khamenei, after the Mohammadkhani incident, Khamenei was asked directly to comment on the ban against the female voice. And he actually issued a statement a couple of days later through his spokesperson saying that he was not against the public broadcast of the solo female voice as long as it was within Islamic an Islamic framework. So of course that sort of conditioning of his statement makes it very difficult again. What is it exactly? So Mukhtarnameh, which was a TV serial on state television, actually had a title that was just a woman's voice. And apparently that counted as being within an Islamic framework because it's about this Shia sort of rebel, and it's an Islamic story. But it's a problem because even this lack of the female voice in the public sphere, I think has had its consequences. Even though women are very active as instrumentalists, they're very active as back vocalists and so on and but the fact that there's so little in the public sphere as far as women musicians, maybe the female voice is concerned, I think had its reflection when underground music was becoming so vibrant in Iran. There weren't actually that many female musicians, even in the underground music scene, even though it wasn't regulated by state authorities. But I think the repercussions, the risks were just higher for female musicians. And I think, again, this lack of the female voice, unfortunately, has had its impact on productivity in that sphere.
Yes. You spoke a little bit about the internet and how it's in some ways an engine for disseminating this music and making it become so pervasive that it's no longer underground. What about sales or using the internet to get, for example, female voices out into the world? Do they use the internet, women, for example?
It's very hard they have been using it. So a lot of female musicians or other musicians, underground musicians, have for a long time used CD Baby to sell their works. That's sort of the site of choice for the sale of music, and some of them have managed to get their music on iTunes and so on. So yes, but the sale of music has been going through a major challenge, not just for Iranian music, but also for Western music. Musicians, for the most part, make their income through public performances. So if you ban their concerts or don't give them permits for concerts, they're unlikely to really be viable, economically viable musicians. But something that did work, for example, for Battlebacks, was that through the dissemination of their work on satellite television channels, expatriate television channels, and also the internet, but really through the diaspora sort of TV channels, they became so widely known that they would give performances in private settings, weddings, birthdays, and charge quite a lot of money. At the time when I interviewed them in 2011, they were charging something like, I think it translated into $3,000 or $4,000 per gig, which is huge, which is the money that they ultimately managed to invest into their burger joints, right? But so that space existed to be able to make money out of these private performances. Yes, please.
What about the Shahin Najafi and Kiosk? I haven't heard anything. Where their music?
Okay. There was a documentary that was aired on Shahin Najafi on PBS recently, a few weeks ago, When God Sleeps. Shahin Najafi didn't actually, I think he is listened to by some in Iran. He didn't actually start as a musician in Iran itself. He really started his music making once he was abroad in Germany. So I think he has less of a connection to audiences in Iran than somebody like Mohsen Namju, for example, does. His works are, as you know, very explicit and very critical, and find their sort of fans in Iran. Kiosk was very important for the first phase of alternative music. Their album Adam Ma'muli was huge, was groundbreaking at the time. Those kinds of lyrics to be set to that kind of music, and they're all over the place. Everybody listened to Kiosk's first album and onward. So I write about, alternative, so I couldn't touch on everything today, but I write about them and as being part of this first expression of the underground music scene in the 90s and 2000s in Iran.
I also have an observation, I should say, that the generation of the first 10 years of the revolution, I've noticed that they're listening, now that, I hang out with them, they're listening to Marziyeh, Cash, and I'm always wondering, those are the music of my parents even, and they're really enjoying it, and I was always wondering why they're doing that, and I was asking them, and their response was that during the revolution, because the music was banned, they were listening to their parents' music tapes. That's the only music that they had.
That's
So
right.
still for them, it's
Carries a lot of nostalgia.
Carries a
If you
lot,
go to
yeah.
these concerts, by Dariush, Ebi, whoever,
right.
the audience is really questioned. There are a lot of young people, and I think it's true. Iranians for nearly 20 years, there were no homemade productions. I mean, they were, like Ahangaran and Kuwaiti Pur and people like that, Nohefuni and sort of, that kind of stuff. Or some sort of more mellow pop music, what's called traditional pop, or, but nothing like that. But for 2 decades, really, they continued listening to either the pre-revolutionary music or music of the same sort of, type coming from Los Angeles. And so it carries a lot of sort of nostalgic meaning for even very young listeners. That's a great observation. Yes, please.
I have a couple of shallow questions.
That's okay.
So that Katalu, is that an artistic name or is that a given name?
His name is Maksudlu. Maksudlu, and it's just his artist name, Tatalu.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
And then what did his tattoos, what was the significance of it that you said he could have covered it but he didn't? Like,
Yeah.
what did it say?
So, oh no, well he actually, in the video, he actually talks to Ibrahim Raisi and says, you see, this is a tattoo for my mother, this is another one. So he actually talks a little bit about, the tattoos. I think the significance is that, having tattoos is still a lot of, actually so many people in Iran have tattoos now, but still to have, to set that image of the rapper with his fully sort of tattooed arms next to the guardian of the holiest shrine in Iran, that couldn't have happened just by accident. That was intentional, and the intention being that, these people, somebody like Ibrahim, they were trying to get votes. This was ahead of the elections. They were trying to present this image of him and get votes for him. That, even somebody like Ibrahim Raisi, this very conservative person, is open to somebody like Amir Tatalu. So, Amir Tatalu's followers, if you see this image, and your idol is voting for Ibrahim Raisi, the hope is that they will also vote for Raisi. Vote for Raisi.
So would you say if this, when you say that they kind of destroyed the underground, they made it kind of mainstream or public, would the Iranians who live there consider that maybe a reform? Do they consider that a positive thing, like something has changed for the better because we have this now, or?
Some of them, yeah, some of them for sure. To be able to go to concerts by, some of these bands is certainly a welcome gesture to be able, and they understand that it's one of the musicians from Bomrani. He actually makes a statement somewhere saying, why does our music have to be political? We're making music, and at the end of the day, we want to have fans, and we want to have people who come and listen to our music and live lives as a musician. So it's not necessarily that any kind of that music has to be. So I think it's welcomed by some, and then it's also looked at, it's a lot of suspicion by others. Apparently, some of these musicians are, this is something that both Mohsen Namju and somebody else, reports on Iran who I spoke to, confirmed. Apparently, some of these musicians are now on monthly salaries. And in this conversation that I had with Namju, he said, I called him up and I said, well, what are you doing all day sitting in that office on the 14th floor of this building and getting your monthly salary? You're a musician. So, playing Nintendo. And every now and then, like, creating my music. But, so it seems to be, it's not exactly sort of coming from the core of, I don't know, it's not like some people sat together and thought, it's different actors seizing opportunities and sensing that it's possible. So one of the people who's been behind all of this is a young man with a lot of money and political connections, and and he's not exactly. It's not exactly sort of the hegemon sort of decided. Just they've sensed opportunity, and the authorities have allowed for it to happen, and so that now when you look at it, it seems like there's something more intentional going on. This can't just if this could have happened at any point in time, well, the point in time for it to have happened mostly would have been, in the 2000s when the underground music scene was really sort of, bustling with a lot of energy and new works. Sorry?
somebody was ahead of me.
Hi. Go on. Yes, please.
Thank you. I wonder if you've looked at Noha Khani. I heard they make a lot of money, a lot more than regular singers, and also how they are using the music of pop song prior to revolution as their music for religious scenes.
Yeah, that's a really interesting phenomenon that's been going on. One of the most popular Noha Khun's Hilali, Abdul-Reza Hilali. I interviewed him a long time ago, like more than 10 years ago. He was very young at the time. And I said, and he was using a lot of, he was using a melody from Moeen, to sing about Imam Hussein. There are other ones now who use Nasabi from Haide to, sing other chants. There's a lot of recycling of these pre-revolutionary pop songs that's going on precisely because of that nostalgic affect and potential that they have, and even these religious people who go to these Noha, not just religious but committed people who go to these Noha Khuni sessions, they too have heard that music. Ali Reza starts saying, how could you not love these musicians? Everybody grew up with them, even in more traditional or religious households. And Abdul Reza Hilali, when I interviewed him, he said, he was very young, so I'm not sure he would say the same today, it was kind of blunt, but he said, it's just like a weapon, like I use it to attract more people to my work. Why not? What's wrong with it? So, yeah.
And did they make a lot of money actually?
Well, they're very well funded. This was one of the pieces of information that was really revealed when the government's budget was published in just toward the end of 2017, which led to the protests and so on, which was partly why protests happened. We found out that yes, these Noha Khuns and these institutions get a lot of support from the government, for these activities. Sure. Yes, please.
Welcome to Berkeley. Once you put it
وای سلام واسه شما ببخشید نشناختم یه ذره نور از پشت میزنه یه ذره بک‌گراند ندیدم شما ببخشید
Welcome to Berkeley.
خیلی ممنون مرسی. Thank you.
And I had the good fortune of working with you. I want to, as always, I want to pin you down on a theoretical question with regard to your field of study. For a very long time, scholars like us in the field of international relations, political science, we thought that globalization and modernization are likely to lead to some kind of evolution of societies over time, and will lead to some kind of political opening and better political climate. As you look at the music and the wonderful job you have done to trace back all these roots of things and its social importance, do you look at music, track music, as something that could be used as a political ploy by the regime to recruit, young demographics in times of elections, and you use the word cooptation, or do you see the possibility of music, this type of music, kind of, culminating into some kind of social tolerance and eventually some kind of political opening in society?
Thank you. I think it's doing both. I think it's doing both. So it certainly has created so many openings. I mean, I don't think this whole, the mass channel of communication could have existed to this extent without the, persistence of musicians to create this work, and also the consumption of that work. So I think, yes, certainly, and globalization and so on has to do with it because, of course, through the internet and satellite television and so on, Iranians are not living in a bubble. I think they're generally not predisposed to living in a bubble. They've always conceived of themselves as being cosmopolitan and being at the crossroads and wanting to know the next newest thing everywhere and so on. But that's also really in the 80s, for example, that was much harder. It really had to come through VHS tapes. There was no satellite television. There was no internet. So in order to gain access to what was happening in the rest of the world was much harder. And even then they did. I remember seeing the latest videos by Michael Jackson and whoever, Pink Floyd, as a child. I mean, if it was out, the next day we had it. I'm not sure how, but so I think it certainly, has. So all of that has been enabled by what we call globalization, right? The routes of commerce that enable the transfer of goods easily and then their dissemination on these media. But now the government also can use those same tools, which I hope sort of I showed toward the end of the talk, in normalizing certain things and normalizing the notion that you know, the certain discourses in music and the complete depoliticization of music, for example, by bringing in people from these different fields and presenting them as musicians that they support, meanwhile, of course, really circumscribing what they can present and offer. But in the process, changing the face of the government and what it represents. But it's, you know, I think we're sort of in the midst of a lot of changes going on and a lot of adaptations by the government, I think, or not. We'll have to see. I think we're sort of at a very critical moment in time. But I know this is just not a very satisfying answer. Sorry.
Thank you.
That's great.
Thank you for this. Thank you very much. Most of the time, the focus, the analytical focus, is on what is happening in Iran. And my question wants to use your beautiful presentation to go a little farther. How far do you think the dynamics, the aesthetics that is now 2 generations happening in Iran is being heard, for example, in traditional Los Angeles aesthetics, or not at all, or being seen as a threat? I happened to be in Georgia with an Iranian tour, and many Iranians had come there to attend the concert, and they were so critical of the Los Angeles, of both Gugush and both Nabi and also Shahram, that they're exploiting us, the music is so repetitive, and the performances are not what we had expected. And to some degree, I could see when there is such a scene in Iran, the Los Angeleses could not survive that easily anymore. And also, the question is, then immediately after, I saw an interview with Shahbal Shahpare that no, we are not stagnant musicians. There is a reason that people still want us to repeat the 2, 3, 4 generations before. So how do you see? Are you hopeful that the dynamic will change something about us here, our scene of music here, or so there should be some kind of a dynamic sense instead of thinking that the Iran is changing, but we are good enough. We don't need that.
Right.
You know?
Good point. Yeah. Yeah. So you know, I think Shahbal Shahpare said something like, "Well, you don't change what's good. What's high quality, you keep it." Something like that. And you know,
high quality.
Right.
Yeah.
And I think that notion of the change happening here, interestingly, is actually happening through the infusion of music and musicians from Iran. So, you know, Shadman Ali is now a very popular singer in LA. Sasi, for example, Hossein Tohi, you know, all these musicians who had created something new, but couldn't manage to keep working as musicians in Iran. They've all left abroad, and I think that infusion is coming. But you know, that is not to discount the work of someone like Gugush, for example, who I think, in her own way, you know, has done a lot of important work. And I would add, you know, Shahram Shahpare and Ebi and so on to that as well. Their music might be repetitive, but it is potent. It's potent because it speaks to an era of time that is still highly idealized. And I'm not sure how good that is, but the fact is that it allows for this space of imagination for people to at least project certain aspirations of the kind of society that they would like to have onto these people. So, but it's a really good point you make. I mean, you know, why do we keep talking about change in Iran when, what about these musicians today? They haven't changed in 40 years, right? Yeah.
I think we have time for maybe one last question, if you...
Sure. Yes, go ahead, please.
Yeah, my question is about traditional music. And actually, when I was younger and I grew up in Iran, so the regime, the Iranian government was basically saying that by this was the time there was no pop music, like in the first 15 years of revolution, and so they were basically packaging it as so by closing such doors, we are basically giving more opportunity to traditional music, and we are letting that to get richer and like has an opportunity. Do you think in that era, in those early years, was that we really had an extra growth, like extraordinary growth of the Persian traditional music, and compared with now that we have a more diverse?
Sure. So someone like Shahjarian is really, begrudges that comment. When I asked him about that, because it's a comment that you hear a lot, which is, oh, it's because of the Islamic Republic that these Persian classical musicians were able to flourish and make the music so popular among the people. First of all, I don't think it's true. I think Persian classical music was quite popular among a certain, the similar set of people. Before the revolution, it did become more popular. I agree, there are many more concerts, and a lot of young people also go to concerts of Persian classical music. But I think we have to sort of temper that statement by Shahjarian's response to me, which was, they really had to struggle to continue making their music too. They couldn't give any concerts in Iran until 1991, I believe 1990 was when Shahjarian had his first concert in Talar Baghdad, and it was really not much of a concert as such. It was a sort of presentation of Hafiz poetry with just one car, maybe a tombak, something like that. It wasn't a full-on. But he said, we had a really hard time. It was hard to even travel with an instrument, to carry your instrument somewhere. There were no funds. They would constantly sort of, raid our buildings. Hossein Darafshan also, Majid Darafshani also said this. And we really continued, we really had to persevere to do this. But at the same time, I think in some ways, the fact that they shut down other types of music did mean that a lot of young people learned to play instruments for classical Persian music and partook in this whole scene. And hence it's a very vibrant scene, not just among the older crowd, as you know, among the young as well. So I think the statement sort of, yes, but we should also give more credit to the musicians for persevering despite the restrictions that they had to put up with.
Thank you for a wonderful presentation, a wonderful book.